To the UK now, where protests are taking place calling for the ban on Palestine Action to be reversed. The government proscribed it as a terrorist organisation earlier this month. Since then, police have arrested dozens of people for supporting the group. Sonia Gallego has been following the story from London.
This is the third weekend that action has taken place in support of Palestine Action since the group was banned by the government. And the reason why it is so contentious to hold these types of actions is because Palestine Action has been prescribed as a terrorist organisation. This follows after members of the group entered into a military airbase and damaged and spray-painted military airplanes as well. Now, there was an earlier attempt to try and postpone the prescription, but that was unsuccessful. Now, since then, there have been some 100 people who have been arrested for simply declaring their support in public. Now, this could potentially carry a jail sentence of up to 14 years in prison. In the meantime, on Monday, there is going to be an application for a judicial review to look at, to see if that ban oversteps the mark of what consists and constitutes a terrorist organisation. In the meantime, critics have said that this contains some very worrying effects for freedom of speech and the right to civil disobedience. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Look at them, all their balaclavas on.
For doing this, heads must roll. There is no way the Chief Constable or the Police and Crime Commissioner in Essex can stay in their posts. This is a disgrace.
Police have
Did Keir Starmer just try to crush political dissent and end up handing Nigel Farage the biggest win of his career? 1 minute, Starmer was issuing calm statements about maintaining public order, and the next, footage exploded across social media, showing peaceful demonstrators being shoved into vans. The crowd was furious. Chanting rang out through the streets. And just when it seemed Labour had locked the narrative down, Nigel Farage kicked the door in. It was supposed to be a low-key security operation, quiet arrests, quick dispersals, no headlines. But then something happened. Protesters refused to back down. Videos leaked, judges intervened, and then came Farage, turning a targeted crackdown into a national scandal. Even senior police chiefs are now questioning what really happened behind the scenes. Starmer tried to paint the demonstrators as fringe radicals, but the footage said otherwise. Flags, banners, peaceful chants, ordinary citizens standing outside Labour headquarters, demanding accountability for broken promises, rising taxes, and a government that seemed more interested in optics than action. And when those protesters started getting detained, when plainclothes officers started dragging people away in front of cameras, the backlash didn't simmer, it exploded. Starmer's team tried to spin the arrests as a necessary measure. They said the protests had escalated, that intelligence suggested foreign influence, and that public safety was the priority. But the public wasn't buying it. These weren't violent mobs. They were pensioners with placards, young workers waving flags, parents marching with children. And the issue? A string of Labour policies viewed as nothing short of betrayal. It started with tax hikes. Then came the housing bills. Then the quietly leaked memo suggesting limits on protest zones. One protester called it the slow choke of free expression. And now that choke had gone public across the UK. A new phrase began trending: red crackdown. And it stuck, because for many this wasn't about one protest or one moment. It was the final straw. Years of promises, of speeches about justice and listening, suddenly collapsed into a single ugly truth. Labour was cracking down on dissent. And that's where Nigel Farage saw his opening. Not in the press rooms, not in Parliament, but in the crowd, in the noise, in the anger that was spreading like wildfire. He didn't wait, he acted. Farage arrived at the protest like a lightning bolt. No teleprompter, no advisors. Just him, a mic, and a crowd ready to listen. He didn't talk policy, he talked betrayal. Betrayal of the people who built Britain. paid their taxes, raised families, and now found themselves branded as threats for daring to speak. He called it what Labour wouldn't dare to say aloud: state intimidation. And the crowd erupted. Cheers drowned out sirens. Farmers in flatbeds honked their horns. Shopkeepers hung banners in solidarity. The movement had a voice now, a face, and it wasn't Starmer's. The Labour machine scrambled. Spokespeople went silent, media allies hesitated. Behind closed doors, aides were frantically drafting new talking points. But it was too late. Farage had already turned the arrests into ammunition, and he fired with precision. He launched a legal defence fund for detained protesters. He posted every video. He read leaked emails live on air. He demanded a full investigation into the use of surveillance on peaceful demonstrators. And for once, even critics had to admit, the man was not just grandstanding, he was organising. What made it worse for Labour was the silence coming from inside their own ranks. No frontbencher dared to speak against the arrests, but many wouldn't defend them either. A few MPs began issuing vague statements about the right to peaceful assembly, carefully worded to avoid angering Starmer's inner circle, but the damage was already spreading. Leaks began trickling out of Labour HQ. Internal messages showed a party more concerned with narrative control than civil liberties. One memo outlined how to identify repeat demonstrators using traffic cameras. Another advised staff to avoid saying the word crackdown in interviews, but none of it worked. The footage kept coming. In Leeds, a young woman was tackled near the steps of a public library for holding a protest sign. In Bristol, 2 elderly men were arrested for refusing to disperse from a quiet corner of the city centre. Their crime? Standing silently with signs that read, "This is not democracy." Farage didn't just amplify the stories, he turned them into momentum. He appeared outside police stations, he brought lawyers with him. He stared into cameras and asked a question Starmer still hasn't answered. When did peaceful protest become a crime? Then came the moment that flipped the entire narrative. A senior judge, speaking off record, leaked a confidential opinion to a major newspaper. It warned that the arrests of protesters could violate the Human Rights Act, particularly articles protecting freedom of assembly and expression. The leak was explosive. It wasn't coming from Farage or Reform UK, or even the Conservative backbenches. It was coming from inside the judicial system. The phrase that rattled every newsroom and courtroom across Britain was simple, direct, and devastating: an unlawful abuse of state authority. Suddenly, it wasn't just a political problem, it was a constitutional crisis in slow motion. Farage seized the moment. He called for an emergency parliamentary session. Reform UK tabled a motion demanding a suspension of all arrests related to political protest until a public inquiry could be held. And though Labour had the numbers to block it, the very act of opposing it added fuel to the fire. Within days, more legal voices joined the chorus. Civil liberties watchdogs published scathing reports. One barrister described the surveillance of protesters as pre-crime policing. The country wasn't just watching anymore, it was choosing sides. And the side they chose wasn't Starmer's. Polls started shifting overnight. Reform UK surged among demographics that had never taken Farage seriously before. Young voters, suburban homeowners, disillusioned Labour loyalists who felt betrayed, not because they agreed with every word Farage said, but because he was the only one saying anything at all. Starmer, meanwhile, disappeared into scripted press events. No questions, no accountability, just vague reassurances about maintaining public order and ongoing reviews. But the more he spoke, the colder it sounded. Footage of peaceful protesters in handcuffs played side by side with Starmer's statements about respecting free speech. Editorials ripped through the contradictions. Even traditionally Labour-leaning papers began running headlines like "Starmer's silence" and "Crisis of conscience." And at the centre of it all, Farage kept climbing. He wasn't offering generic outrage. He had numbers, documents, eyewitnesses. And with every news cycle, he looked less like a fringe firebrand and more like the only political figure willing to confront what was happening. He had done something Starmer couldn't. He connected with the public's gut instinct. That something was wrong. That the balance had shifted. That ordinary citizens were being treated like enemies in their own country. By the third week, the protests evolved. They weren't just about anti-Labour slogans anymore, they had turned into a national reckoning. Protesters began carrying signs that read, "We are the majority," and "This is still Britain." Truckers joined in, small business owners closed shops in solidarity, and in some towns, even local police officers quietly refused to carry out new arrest orders. It became impossible to contain. Farage organised a massive demonstration in Birmingham, drawing tens of thousands. No violence, no chaos, just people, old, young, rich, poor, united by one message. They would not be intimidated by a government that forgot who it serves. Meanwhile, inside Labour's leadership circle, the panic was visible. Sources revealed internal polls showing double-digit drops in key swing constituencies. Whispers of a leadership review began circulating in Westminster. Staffers were split. Some urged Starmer to stand firm, others begged him to retreat and apologise before things collapsed further. But Starmer didn't budge. And that became the story. While the country roared, he stood silent. While legal scholars, media outlets and thousands of ordinary people demanded answers, he doubled down behind pre-approved talking points. And in doing so, he didn't just lose control of the protests, he lost control of the narrative. Then came the breaking point. A cache of internal Labour communications was leaked: emails, WhatsApp chats and briefing documents. They showed senior figures discussing how to de-patrify protest leaders, how to guide media framing to suggest extremist ties, and how to use local councils to pressure event venues into cancellations. One message stood out. It described the rural protesters as logistical liabilities and high-risk optics. Another bluntly asked, "Do we have a legal route to shut this down permanently?" When those messages hit the press, the outrage was seismic. This wasn't speculation anymore, it was evidence. A political party once built on grassroots activism, now seen actively working to silence opposition through back channels and coercion. Farage took the documents and went live that night. No script, just him at a desk with a stack of printouts and a camera. For an hour, he read every line. Paused after each one, let it sink in. "Is this your Labour Party?" he asked, and across Britain millions nodded. Not in agreement, but in disgust. It didn't matter if you were Reform, Tory, Green, or a lifelong Labour voter. That moment crossed a boundary deeper than party loyalty. It was about trust, and Labour had shattered it. By now, the movement had outgrown Farage. What began as protest against one policy had turned into a national reckoning. Trade unions began issuing cautious statements. Celebrities who once campaigned for Labour started distancing themselves. On social media, the hashtag #WeRememberWhoYouAre trended for days, paired with clips of arrests, leaked emails and press silence. A group of independent MPs called for an official parliamentary inquiry. Civil liberties lawyers announced they would be pursuing legal action against the Home Office. Local councils in 3 regions passed symbolic resolutions condemning the government's approach to peaceful protest. And still, Starmer refused to bend. His party issued one final press release, a bland promise to review our public order strategy in the coming months. But there was no apology, no acknowledgement, no attempt at reconciliation. Farage responded instantly. "Too late," he said. "You don't get to break trust and buy it back with a press release." He launched the Rural Britain Charter, a formal policy document outlining legal protections for protest, bans on surveillance without warrants, and automatic judicial review for any arrest made at a political demonstration. And just like that, he wasn't reacting anymore. He was leading. What followed was something even Labour's oldest critics hadn't predicted. The National Union of Journalists issued a rare public condemnation, not of Farage, but of Starmer's government. They cited cases where reporters covering protests were denied access, questioned by police, or had their footage seized without warrants. One incident involved a local cameraman in Essex who was detained for filming the arrest of 2 farmers. His gear was confiscated, his footage wiped, but he had backups. And when the video surfaced online, showing officers stepping in to block the lens, public confidence in Labour's message hit rock bottom. While Reform UK wasn't slowing down. They held town halls in every major rural county within 2 weeks. People packed into barns, school halls, even car parks, just to hear what the movement was doing next. And at each stop, Farage hammered the same message. This isn't about ideology, it's about liberty. If they can silence farmers today, they can silence you tomorrow. That line stuck. It made its way into headlines, into editorials, into pub conversations and church bulletins. It wasn't political spin, it was common sense. And the more Labour denied the reality unfolding in front of the nation, the more out of touch they appeared. Inside Labour HQ, the fractures deepened. Senior MPs were now openly briefing against Starmer to the press. One frontbencher anonymously told a reporter, "This isn't just a communications crisis, it's a leadership crisis." Multiple resignations followed. A deputy party chair stepped down, citing irreconcilable differences over the treatment of demonstrators. 2 rural councillors defected to Reform UK in live interviews. A whistleblower released an audio clip of a strategy meeting where a senior Labour official referred to the protesters as ungrateful leeches. That clip went viral. Overnight it became a rallying cry. The next morning protest crowds doubled. Not just farmers now, but miners, transport workers, nurses and public service staff. Groups Labour once proudly claimed to represent, Farage capitalised on it immediately. He stood on a truck bed in Yorkshire, megaphone in hand, pointing toward Parliament. Held their careers off your backs, your votes, your loyalty. And look what they'd done with it. The crowd roared. It wasn't a protest anymore, it was a political reckoning. Not in debates or on panels, but in real places. On the roads, in the farms, at the food markets, and in front of town halls. Starmer hadn't just miscalculated, he had ignited something his party could no longer control. Then came the final humiliation. An independent tribunal, fast-tracked due to public pressure, released an interim report on the government's actions during the protests. It concluded that there had been a disproportionate use of police powers, systemic failures in oversight, and potential breaches of the European Convention on Human Rights. The report's tone was clinical. Its implications were volcanic. Labour tried to deflect, blaming local police leadership and miscommunications. But by now, no one was listening. The public had made up its mind. This wasn't about policing errors, it was about political intent. Farage held a nationally televised address the same night. Standing in front of a field at dusk, camera lights flickering in the wind, he looked directly into the lens. You were lied to, watched, threatened, dragged away for daring to speak, and the people who did it smiled while calling it progress. It was a quiet speech, no fireworks, no shouting, but it landed like a hammer. Viewership broke records. Clips were shared millions of times. Hashtags trended for days. Even international media picked it up, framing it as a textbook example of political overreach and grassroots resistance. By the end of that week, Starmer's approval rating was the lowest of any Labour leader in modern polling history. Labour tried to recover with a last-minute press release promising dialogue and review, but the damage was done. After arrests, leaks and public fury, no one was interested in vague reassurances. Farage, meanwhile, launched a national freedom tour, meeting rural communities face to face. Crowds showed up in droves, not for politics, but for answers. Starmer didn't just mishandle a protest, he lost control of the country's trust. His silence, his crackdown, and his refusal to take responsibility turned a policy into a political collapse. Farage didn't start the movement, but he gave it a voice. And when Labour tried to crush dissent, the people pushed back harder. In the end, Starmer didn't just lose control, he lost the nation.